The spire of Fenkarath looked out of place even from orbit. No matter how high resolution the feed from our external sensors, it never rendered properly on our displays. The surface seemed alive in a way that wasn't biological or mechanical, just unstable. 20 kilometers tall, with no discernible taper, it should have toppled under its own weight. Yet there it was, violating basic engineering principles with the same indifference it showed to gravity. Nothing about this mission felt right. Not the spire, not the barren world below, and definitely not the stakes. The Torval system wasn't just dying, it was actively trying to kill us. Our red giant star, Torval Prime, had swollen to catastrophic levels, flooding its orbiting planets with radiation and gravitational instability. The outer colonies were gone, either abandoned or annihilated in tidal upheavals. What remained of humanity in the system was concentrated on Torval 4, a narrow band of livable zones on a world barely clinging to survival. With every passing year, those zones shrank as radiation levels rose and temperatures climbed beyond tolerable limits. We needed a way out. And soon. That's why we were here. The Spire had been flagged during deep scan surveys of Torval 7, a planet that shouldn't have been worth anyone's attention. No vegetation, no water, no resources. Its tectonic activity was constant but shallow. Its atmosphere a toxic mix of nitrogen and xenon. Yet when the Spire was discovered, a structure older than any known civilization, emitting signals that baffled us, it became our best shot. Theories varied, but the most hopeful one was also the most absurd. The Spire wasn't a structure at all, but a machine, a gateway, something built to punch through space-time, offering a way out of the system and, potentially, into another. The simulations we'd run back on Torval 4 couldn't confirm it, but they couldn't rule it out either. And with the system's death looming, we didn't have the luxury of waiting for certainty. Humanity's survival depended on answers, on finding something inside the Spire that could help us escape. That was the mission. Extract alien data, retrieve artifacts, and bring them back to the Argon Accord scientists on Torval 4. It sounded simple on paper, but from the moment we'd first seen the Spire, I'd known it wouldn't be. It was the kind of structure that didn't care whether we understood it or not. And the longer I stared at it, the less certain I was that we'd leave this world with anything more than regrets. I pulled my harness tighter as our shuttle approached the base camp, the small modular structure standing out against the cracked, barren crust of Torval 7. There were no landmarks, just ridges and gashes in the ground, their depths unmeasurable due to radiation interference. "Landing zone clear," I reported to Corbin, who piloted the shuttle. "Yeah, clear as it's gonna be. Radiation spike on approach," he muttered, tapping at the controls. His voice was even, though I noticed he rechecked our shielding diagnostics 3 times in as many minutes. The touchdown was smooth, almost routine despite the circumstances. I stepped onto the surface first, scanning the area. Harlan Greaves, one of the junior technicians, followed me out, carrying a case of tools and portable sensors. He moved quickly, his helmet swiveling as he took in the barren landscape. New to fieldwork, but capable enough. At least, that's what the briefing had said. My visor overlay showed a predictable list of hazards. Atmosphere unbreathable, seismic instability, ambient radiation nearing upper operational tolerances. Perfect conditions for an archaeological dig. Dr. Charles Drake descended next, his tall frame moving with the rigidity of someone who thought little of the elements but a great deal of the mission. Ward status? Seismic activity negligible for now. Air's toxic, but we knew that. Radiation's climbing slower than projected. Base is intact. I paused, letting my attention shift to the Spire in the distance. That thing hasn't moved. Drake followed my line of sight. "Of course it hasn't. Begin base operations immediately. We'll start external scans within the hour." The base was a prefabricated cylinder, modular enough to survive moderate quakes but simple enough to assemble in hours. Lennox Corbin oversaw its deployment, grumbling about electromagnetic interference scrambling our tools. "You know this isn't going to hold if the planet throws a tantrum, right?" "It'll hold long enough," I countered, watching Corbin unfold the solar arrays. I had my doubts too, but voicing them wouldn't stabilize the ground beneath us. Inside, Professor Philip Finch was already calibrating the team's diagnostic systems. He muttered to himself while linking his portable analyzer to a larger server array. Preliminary readings suggest fluctuating energy fields emanating from within the spire, possibly dimensional in nature. "You mean it's leaking something?" I said, leaning against the doorway. "It isn't leaking," Finch snapped, irritation clear. "It's producing. It's active. There's a distinction." Drake's voice cut through our exchange. "Active or not, it doesn't alter the mission parameters. We retrieve functional data. That's all. Keep your theories productive, Professor." Finch nodded, though he didn't look pleased. I wasn't either. Data retrieval was easy when dealing with broken satellites or derelict ships. This wasn't that. By the time we stood 2 kilometers from the Spire's base, my doubts had deepened. The walk over had been uneventful, apart from minor seismic vibrations underfoot. Yet the Spire seemed to grow in size, a trick of perspective that none of us commented on aloud. Corbin carried the portable scanner, a boxy device designed to collect data at short range. He crouched near the base of the Spire, positioning the scanner against its surface. "Surface temperature's low, cooler than the surrounding area by 20 degrees Celsius, he announced. "Materials, weird. Reflectivity is inconsistent across wavelengths. It's throwing back incomplete readings." Drake leaned closer, peering at the scanner display. "Focus on structural density. We need a baseline." Corbin adjusted the device. "No good. Whatever this thing's made of, it isn't homogeneous. Density fluctuates across the surface too, like it's—" "Don't speculate," Drake interrupted. "Record the data." I surveyed the surrounding landscape while they worked. The Spire cast no shadow, despite the dim red star overhead. That wasn't right, but I didn't voice it. The Spire had already broken too many rules. What was one more? Finch, standing slightly apart, had his own device out, a compact electromagnetic spectrum analyzer. The interference spikes are rhythmic, not random, every 60 seconds, give or take. "And it's disrupting comms already," Corbin added, holding up his wrist monitor. "We're going to lose signal with base if we stay much longer." "Then we don't stay longer," I said, keeping my tone even. "You got what you needed, Doc?" "Hardly," Drake said, though he turned back toward the base. "We'll analyze this first set of data before proceeding further. Ward, lead us out." The debrief in the base was tense. Finch paced while explaining his findings, a habit that grated on me. The Spire's geometry doesn't conform to its external structure. The internal layout, what little the drones scanned, loops back on itself. Corridors repeat or fold into dimensions our instruments can't measure. "So a maze," I summarized. "A deadly one, probably." "It's not a maze," Finch insisted. "It's recursive, self-referential. It might not even be physical in the way we understand." I turned to Drake, who was reviewing the drone footage. "Do we really think this thing has what we need? Enough to risk walking into that?" Drake's eyes didn't leave the screen. "We don't think. We test. Humanity's survival depends on this." I couldn't argue with that. The Torval system had years, maybe decades, before its red giant swallowed the last inhabitable zones. Finding a way out, whether through advanced propulsion or interdimensional transport, was the priority. But knowing the stakes didn't make walking into an anomaly sound any smarter. The drones went in first. They were high-end, equipped with redundant systems to handle radiation, seismic instability, and electromagnetic interference. None of it mattered. The first drone transmitted footage of a corridor that looped endlessly. Its camera showed the same carved wall sections repeating, though its internal odometry recorded forward movement. After 30 minutes, the feed cut out. The second drone's feed lasted longer but showed something different. The corridor twisted mid-transmission, folding back into itself. Then came the symbols, alien glyphs etched into the walls. Corbin analysed the footage and noted that the glyphs hadn't been present in the earlier scans. "The structure's responding," he said. "Changing. Maybe reacting to the drones." Finch perked up. "It's adaptive. That's significant. Possibly intelligent. Possibly hostile," I countered. "Not necessarily," Finch said. "It might not even recognize us as entities. We're projecting our assumptions onto it." Drake spoke decisively. "We've gathered enough to justify manned exploration. Tomorrow we'll enter with full protocols." "No," I said. The word left my mouth before I thought better of it. "We don't know enough to walk into that. The drones failed. We'll fail worse." Drake didn't even look at me. "Noted, Lieutenant. Let's stick to mission priorities." That night, I reviewed the mission parameters again, hoping they'd offer some clarity. They didn't. What they did offer was a reminder of why I was here. Not to question the mission's wisdom, but to ensure its survival. The team depended on me to watch their backs, even if I didn't agree with their decisions. The Spire wasn't going anywhere, but humanity's time was running out. We had to act, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. And stepping into the unknown was tomorrow's mission. The next day arrived without ceremony, bringing with it the weight of decisions made and risks accepted. I've walked into hostile zones before. They all share a common denominator: unpredictability. Whether it's an insurgent ambush or a cave-in from unstable terrain, the key is always the same: control what you can and prepare for what you can't. The Spire was different. There was no standard operating procedure for stepping into a structure that violated physics. Our equipment was state-of-the-art, but the Spire didn't care. We'd reinforced our suits for radiation and electromagnetic interference. Each one had an internal mapping system, neural monitoring patches, and a deployable trail marker for navigation. All of it was cutting edge. None of it was guaranteed to work. "Final check." My voice came out calm, clipped, the kind of tone I'd cultivated to manage pre-mission nerves. "Suit integrity nominal," Corbin confirmed, testing the seal on his helmet. "Comms running, but let's not count on them for long." Finch was next. "Electromagnetic analyzer online. Signal degradation expected within the first kilometer. Neural feedback sensors at baseline." "Stop talking like a checklist," I muttered, watching Drake adjust his oxygen intake. "Let's move." Drake was the last to respond. "Protocol is paramount. We stick to the plan. No improvisation unless the situation demands it. Understood?" We all nodded. Improvisation wasn't a strength in a place like this. The entrance was an arched gap in the Spire's surface, 12 meters high and perfectly smooth. There was no visible mechanism, no seam. It hadn't been there in the drone footage the day before. Corbin scanned it with his handheld device and frowned. "No structural anomalies at the threshold," he reported. "But the material composition is inconsistent with the outer surface, like it was grown, not built." Drake's response was quick. "Log it, proceed." Crossing the threshold was uneventful. Our boots touched solid ground, and our suit systems operated smoothly without issue. Inside, the walls curved inward slightly, forming a corridor about 8 meters wide. The same strange material reflected light inconsistently, making the space feel larger than it was. We set reflective beacons every 10 meters to mark our path, though Corbin warned us they might not remain effective. Reflectivity shifts on the surface. These markers could fade or distort. "Set them anyway," I said. "We'll take any redundancy we can get." The corridor extended for approximately 700 meters before opening into a vast chamber. The first thing we noticed was the temperature. It dropped sharply, though our suits compensated automatically. Finch scanned the area, muttering numbers under his breath. "This looks like an archive," Drake said, stepping forward, his eyes focused on the chamber's contents, "or some kind of storage system." Dozens of metallic lattices jutted from the floor, their structures interwoven like three-dimensional puzzles. Each one was about 2 meters tall. Corbin approached one of the lattices, his scanner trained on its surface. Energy readings are localized. This isn't just storage, it's active, probably computational. I stayed back watching the walls. They were smoother here, and the curvature made the chamber feel like it was folding in on itself. It wasn't claustrophobic, but it gave the impression that the space wasn't as static as it appeared. Finch crouched near another lattice, connecting his electromagnetic analyzer. These patterns aren't random. They're encoded data. The structure is likely storing. He stopped mid-sentence. His breathing became irregular, and his hand twitched. Corbin stepped in quickly, pulling the analyzer away and disconnecting it. Neural feedback spike, Corbin reported, checking Finch's vitals on his wrist display. Whatever you just did, don't do it again. Finch sat back, blinking rapidly. It's the data. It's not static, it's interacting. Get away from it, I ordered. That's not something we mess with until we know more. Agreed, Corbin said. Prolonged exposure could fry us. Drake ignored us, circling the chamber. This could be the breakthrough we need. Document everything. We'll analyze it back at the base. Beyond the archive chamber, the corridor split into 3 directions. We chose the middle path, following Drake's insistence that it aligned with the drone's initial trajectory. It wasn't long before we found the remains. They were embedded in the wall, bones fused into the surface as if they'd been absorbed. The skeletons weren't human, their proportions were off, with abnormally long limbs and no obvious ribcage. Corbin scanned one. Compositions partially organic, partially something else. These things weren't human, maybe not even carbon-based. Finch knelt beside another embedded form. These beings used tools. They had technology. The tools were metal objects that looked more ornamental than functional. One, a fork-like device, reacted when Corbin touched it. It vibrated gently and emitted a low-frequency sound audible through our suit comms. Put it down, I said immediately. It's harmless, Corbin argued. Put it down anyway. Drake intervened. We'll bring it back for analysis. Keep moving. The corridor stretched ahead, narrowing slightly as it bent to the left. The floor beneath us felt subtly uneven, like a surface molded instead of constructed. Finch scanned the walls as we moved, the noise of his analyzer breaking the silence. This curvature's intentional, he muttered, almost to himself. A functional design, but for what purpose? Less speculation, more movement, I replied. We turned another corner, the glow of the beacons behind us still visible, though dimmer than before. Just as I noted the change, the first tremor hit. It was light, barely more than a ripple underfoot, but enough to dislodge particles from the ceiling. Seismic event, I reported automatically. Magnitude under 3.0. Minimal threat for now. Corbin paused to glance at his scanner. Yeah, but look at this. Frequency's too regular, almost like... He trailed off, frowning at the display. Like what? I asked. Like something triggered it, he said. The second tremor came 5 minutes later, stronger this time. The walls groaned. Not audibly, but through a vibration our suits picked up. The beacons we'd left flickered, their reflective surfaces dimming. Spire's shifting, Corbin warned. Structure's rearranging itself. Back to the archive chamber, I said. No, Drake countered. We move forward. We can't lose momentum. The third tremor collapsed the corridor behind us. Dust and rubble filled the space, and my visor warned of increased particulate density. Rerouting mandatory, I said, glaring at Drake. Your call. He hesitated, then pointed left. This way. We moved quickly but with focus, marking our path with the remaining beacons. The new corridor sloped downward. My visor flashed warnings about suit strain as we passed through pockets of radiation. Finch stumbled once, muttering under his breath. When I helped him up, he shook his head. This place, it's not random. It's a building, I said. Nothing's random. No, he insisted. It's reactive. I didn't respond. Arguments weren't going to help. Corbin's voice cut in. I'm getting irregularities on the markers. Reflectivity's gone. I turned to check, and sure enough, the beacons weren't visible. The trail we'd left was gone. Drake, I called. We're losing the path. We need to stop and reassess. No, he said. "We're too close. We'll find another way back." "That's not a guarantee," I said, "and you know it. Neither is survival if we leave empty-handed." He gestured at the spire around us. "This is our best shot. Keep moving." The glow from our last beacon was fading, casting fragmented light down the sloping corridor. I stared at it, frowning as the signal finally failed entirely, leaving us without a visual trace of where we'd been. "Reflectivity just dropped off completely," Corbin said, shaking his head as he checked his device. "The trail markers aren't working anymore. It's like the Spire's reconfiguring itself and overwriting the signals we left behind." "Overwriting them how?" I asked. "Not sure yet. Either the surfaces are absorbing the reflected light, or the markers themselves are being altered. Either way, we can't rely on them anymore." Drake didn't even slow his pace. "We'll adjust. Keep moving forward. We document, we adapt, and we find another way out if necessary." I clenched my jaw but said nothing. My gut told me to stop, assess, and turn back. But Drake's tone brooked no argument. He was already scanning ahead, muttering observations into his recorder. "Walls are narrowing slightly, curve tightening. Temperatures dropped another 4 degrees. Finch, confirm energy field density here." Finch trudged along beside Corbin, his analyzer out but his focus waning. "Field density spiking again," he said after a moment, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "There's a pattern to the flux, but I can't isolate it. Too much interference." He stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall. "You good, Finch?" I asked, stepping closer. "Fine," he said, though his tone was distant. "Just a headache. Interference could be affecting neural activity." "Corbin?" I prompted. Corbin glanced at Finch's readings, frowning. "Neural monitoring shows a spike in activity. Nothing critical yet, but prolonged exposure might cause cognitive issues. We should limit contact with active surfaces." Drake cut him off. "We're already committed. Keep recording. Finch, let me know if your condition worsens." The corridor finally opened into another chamber, and even Drake stopped to take it in. The room was massive, its boundaries fading into shadow. Unlike the earlier spaces, this one was dominated by a central structure, a cylindrical platform encased in the same reflective material as the spire's walls. The platform released a soft buzz with sporadic flashes of light flickering across its surface. Suspended above it, distorted shape hung in the air, like a rupture in the fabric of space itself. It pulsed in a consistent beat, getting larger and more intense with each cycle. Corbin's scanner went wild as he approached. Energy readings are through the roof. Electromagnetic, thermal, gravitational, you name it. Whatever this thing is, it's not stable. "It's a rift," Finch whispered, stepping closer. His earlier fatigue seemed forgotten, replaced by an almost frantic energy. "A dimensional rift. The Spire's functioning as a gateway." Drake nodded, his expression intense. "Document everything. This is it. The confirmation we needed." "This is a death trap," I countered, stepping in front of Finch to keep him from moving closer. "You're not walking into that." "I wasn't planning to," Finch said, though his focus stayed fixed on the rift. "Not yet, but look at it. It's responding to its environment. The ripples, the oscillations, they're linked to our presence." Corbin shook his head. "I don't like this. The rift's expanding with each cycle. We don't know what happens if it destabilizes completely. We don't know what happens if we leave it unchecked either," Drake said. He turned to Finch. "Can you isolate the rift's control mechanism? See if there's a way to stabilize it." Finch hesitated, then nodded, already pulling out his tools. "I'll need time, and proximity." "No," I said, stepping between him and the platform. "You've already seen what this place does to people who get too close. You're not exposing yourself to that." "Step aside, Ward," Drake ordered. "This isn't a debate," I shot back. "The moment he starts tampering with that thing, we lose control of the situation." "Control!" Drake barked, his tone sharp. "We've never had control. The only thing we have is opportunity, and I won't squander it because you're afraid of the unknown." "I'm not afraid of the unknown," I said evenly. "I'm afraid of stupidity. We don't know how to shut this thing down, and we sure as hell don't know how to survive it if it reacts badly." The argument was interrupted by the sudden collapse of part of the chamber's floor. It happened without warning. The ground buckled beneath Harlan, the junior technician. He let out a brief scream before plummeting into the void below, the sound of breaking bones echoing as he disappeared into the darkness. I rushed to the edge of the collapse. My visor showed no signs of movement below, only a sharp drop into darkness. "Back away," Corbin said, pulling me back. "The floor's unstable. You'll just add another casualty." "Another reason to leave," I said, rounding on Drake. "We're losing people. The Spire's actively fighting us now. And you still want to push ahead." "This is the cost of progress," Drake said coldly. "You think history remembers the names of those who fell along the way? No, it remembers results." I stepped closer, glaring at him. "Results don't mean much if no one survives to deliver them." "Enough!" Drake snapped. "We're not retreating." While the argument continued, Finch worked in silence, his attention fixed on the rift. He adjusted his analyzer, muttering to himself as the oscillations became more pronounced. "I can see it," he said suddenly. "The interactions. It's a map, a navigational interface. The rift's not random. It's charting a path to..." "To what?" Corbin asked, his tone wary. "Another dimension. Another reality," Finch said, his eyes wide. "It's designed to connect two distinct planes of existence. If I can just..." He stepped toward the platform, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't!" Finch struggled against me, his expression frantic. "We're so close. You don't understand. This isn't just a gateway. It's a lifeline. Humanity's salvation." "It's not salvation if it kills you," I said, holding him firmly. "We can't use technology we don't understand. Back off." Drake intervened, pulling Finch free of my grip. "He's right, Ward. This is bigger than you, or me, or any of us. Let him work." Before I could stop him, Finch stepped onto the platform, his analyzer in hand. The rift flashed brighter, its oscillations becoming erratic. The distortion expanded, briefly stabilizing before erupting into a burst of light and sound. When the light subsided, Finch was gone. In his place, the rift had grown larger, its edges glowing fiercely. Through the crack, we saw a world that was beyond reason. Planets hung stationary in the sky, while stars seemed to orbit them. Liquids floated freely in the air, coalescing into shifting patterns. Immense, indistinct shapes moved in the distance, their forms impossible to define. Corbin's voice broke the silence. "This isn't a passage, it's a rupture." "We need to leave," I said firmly. Drake stared at the rift. "Not yet. We document, we observe. This could be..." The chamber shook violently, cutting him off. The rift's energy began to spike uncontrollably, sending shockwaves through the room. "No more arguments," I said, grabbing Drake's arm. "We're done here." Reluctantly, he nodded and we turned to retreat. Behind us, the rift continued to expand, its chaotic energy consuming the space where Finch had stood. The chamber collapsed around us as we fled, the rift swelling to fill the space behind us. I gestured for Corbin to move ahead, holding my pace firm despite the rubble raining from above. The floor shifted beneath us, every step more unstable than the last. Corbin checked his scanner mid-stride. "The ground's getting worse. Stability is dropping fast." I kept close behind him, focusing on the path ahead. "Keep going. We need to get out of here before it gives way entirely." The spire was alive with activity. Corridors twisting, walls reforming, and every path forward becoming more treacherous. Finch's sacrifice, the collapsing chamber, and the expansion of the rift had shattered any illusion of control. At this point, survival felt like a distant hope, and we were running on instinct alone. The corridor opened suddenly into a smaller, more defined space, its geometry starkly different from anything we'd seen before. Unlike the spire's shifting, irregular passages, this chamber was orderly. 6 walls meeting at precise angles, the floor and ceiling forming a perfect cube. At the center of the room stood a large, hexagonal console. Its surface glowed softly with a pattern of lights and symbols that appeared almost inviting. Corbin's eyes were glued to his scanner. "This is the epicenter of the Spire's activity. Whatever controls this place, it's here." Drake approached the console without hesitation, running his hand along its edge. "This is the failsafe," he said, his voice calm but resolute. The Spire wasn't built to sustain an uncontrolled rift. This mechanism can seal it, stop everything, but it requires a constant operator. I stepped forward, gripping his arm. Define constant operator. He didn't flinch. Whoever activates it stays here, permanently. Their neural input locks the system into stasis. So it's not a failsafe, Corbin said. It's a trap. Another monument to whatever civilization built this place, asking for custodians to preserve it. Drake turned to face us. It's a failsafe because it works. It stops the rift, isolates the Spire, and prevents this technology from destabilizing further. It's the only way. No, I said flatly. The only way is finding another option. We don't commit to something we don't understand. There's no time for another option, Drake argued. He gestured back towards the corridor we'd come from. Do you see that? The rift's collapsing the structure behind us. If we don't act, it won't just destroy us, it'll destabilize the entire Torval system. Corbin raised his hands, palms outward, trying to diffuse the tension. Look, we need to think this through. If the Spire's systems are already reacting to us, there's a chance activating this thing could make it worse. We don't know how it interprets human input. Drake glared at him. We've seen enough to know that this civilization built the Spire for control. The failsafe is designed to isolate it, contain the damage. The mechanism makes sense. It makes sense to you, I said, stepping between them. To me, it looks like we're about to hand the keys to something we don't understand, and you're volunteering to do it on a whim. Drake's jaw tightened. This isn't a whim, Ward. This is necessity. Humanity's survival hinges on us understanding and preserving what we find. That's always been the mission. Corbin interjected, his voice quieter but no less firm. Maybe we've already gone too far. Maybe the Spire wasn't meant for us to use. Have you thought about that? About the consequences of interfering with something we'll never comprehend? Drake didn't respond immediately. For the first time there was hesitation in his movements, but it was brief. He straightened, turning back to the console. I've made my decision, he said. Drake began interacting with the console. His movements were careful but confident, pressing specific glyphs in a sequence that caused the device to glow brighter. Drake, step away from that thing, I said, rushing forward. He raised a hand to stop me, his expression calm. This isn't up for debate, Ward. Someone has to do this. You know I'm right. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming to drag him back. But he didn't stop, and neither did the console. The lights around the chamber intensified, forming patterns across the walls. Corbin was scanning furiously. It's stabilizing the rift. Energy output is dropping, but the neural interface is engaging. Drake, if you go through with this, you won't come back. I know, Drake said simply. He turned to face us one last time. This mission was never about survival. Not ours, anyway. It's about ensuring humanity has a future, even if we're not part of it. If this is the cost, so be it. The console produced a soft sound as the glyphs on its surface began to move. Drake's body stiffened slightly, his hands locking into place against the device. Vitals are dropping, Corbin reported, his scanner shaking in his hands. The interface is absorbing him. Neural activity is spiking. The rift's energy began to stabilize as the chamber filled with a bright, uniform light. The chaotic fluctuations that had defined the Spire's activity were replaced by a steady rhythm. It's the bubble, Corbin said. Temporal stasis is activating. The Spire's locking itself down. Drake didn't move. His body was frozen in place, his expression serene but unresponsive. The light from the console enveloped him, and the chamber was still. We have to go, I said, grabbing Corbin by the shoulder. We bolted from the control chamber, retracing our steps through the collapsing corridors. The Spire continued to shift around us, but the chaos was muted, as though the failsafe's activation had calmed its reactive behavior. By the time we reached the Spire's entrance, the rift's energy had dissipated completely. The structure behind us was silent, its geometry no longer twisting. Corbin stopped at the threshold, turning to look back. He did it. It's contained. I didn't respond. My focus was on getting us back to the base. The Spire might have stabilized, but This place was still dangerous, and I wasn't taking any chances. At the base, the remaining team gathered what was left of our equipment. The Spire stood in the distance, encased in an energy field. Corbin sat at the console, transmitting our findings to the Argon Accord. "Do you think they'll ever understand it?" he asked when the transmission was complete. "No," I said, adjusting the straps on my gear. "But they'll keep trying." "And Drake?" I glanced back at the Spire, its outline barely visible against the horizon. He made his choice. He believed in what he was doing. That's more than I can say for the rest of us. Corbin nodded, though his expression was grim. "And us? What now?" "Now?" I said, stepping toward the shuttle. "We go home. What's left of it?" As we ascended into orbit, I looked back at Torval 7 one last time. The Spire, now frozen in its stasis, stood as a symbol of our desperation. We had come here hoping to escape a dying system, but all we uncovered was a truth too large, too indifferent for us to wield. Survival felt as far away now as it had when we arrived.